and the Beatle uproar quickly went global.
There are rumors around that this is Britain's revenge for the Boston Tea Party. 3,000 screaming teenagers are at New York's Kennedy Airport to greet, you guessed it, the Beatles. This rock and roll group has taken over as the kingpins of musical appreciation among the younger element.
On February 7th, 1964, the Fab Four arrived in the United States for an appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show.
What none of them could have been prepared for was the absolute scale of the reception which awaited them. Absolutely nothing, even faintly like this, had ever happened to anybody from their background. First of all, there had been no big rock and roll stars from Britain in terms of the American audience. And secondly, no working class kids from Liverpool had ever been subjected to the kind of barrage of fame and adulation which now greeted George and the rest of the Beatles.
The first of the Beatles just arriving.
It must have been the strangest possible experience, and I think it brought them, all of them, a lot closer together.
Did you hope to get a haircut at all?
No, but I had one yesterday.
Their now legendary performances on The Ed Sullivan Show only served to ratchet up the frenzy both in the U.S. and all over the world. Beatlemania, replete with fan clubs, posters, copycat clothing, and haircuts, even dolls, was now gripping the world. Lennon and McCartney received the lion's share of attention from media and fans. They were regarded as fun-loving and outgoing. George Harrison was seen as reserved and retiring.
I mean, it's partly to do with the fact that he didn't smile much, and that's why he tended to sort of be regarded as rather a sort of, if you like, almost sullen character. I mean, although whenever he smiled on stage, because it was such a rare event, all the girls would scream. That was his big moment. Well, that, and when him and Paul used to sort of bear in on the mic together and go, ooh, during Twist and Shout. I think that he also looked kind of poetic in a way. He had what you'd call suffering cheekbones, I think.
You never sensed in him that it was about, you know, he loved that spotlight. And you hear that in his playing. Even on record, he wasn't someone who ever hogged the spotlight, probably to a flaw.
My first feelings about George was that he was maybe a bit snobbish, but which came as we got to know each other was totally so far removed from the truth. George was such a lovely guy, and he thought about things.
Lennon and McCartney were writing most of the Beatles songs, but Harrison did contribute a few. For their second album, he wrote his first recorded song, Don't Bother Me.
Since she's been gone, I don't want to talk to me. It's not the same, but I'm to blame, it's plain to see.
It might have been a harbinger of what lay ahead. And even though he was the best guitarist in the group and now playing lead, George still felt second class next to Lennon and McCartney.
I think he was kind of halfway up the hierarchy, if you like. He was somewhere in between the road crew and the high command of John and Paul, Brian Epstein and the producer, you know, George Martin. He was regarded as very much a tool for Lennon and McCartney's masterworks.
Harrison's confidence was further undermined by their record producer, George Martin.
He would never scream and shout or be abusive, but in little ways he made Harrison feel sort of inferior. He would tell him exactly what solo to play on his guitar. He would spell out the notes on the piano and say, play those notes on your guitar.
Harrison got his revenge of sorts in the spring of 1964 when the Beatles began shooting their first feature film, A Hard Day's Night. One scene in particular is very revealing about George.
He runs into a bunch of pretentious youth TV producers and presenters who don't recognise him and treat him as you know, with the contempt that they reserved for real teenagers. And you see him quietly and sardonically and sarcastically absolutely taking them apart.
She's a trendsetter. It's her profession.
She's a drag, a well-known drag. We turn the sound down on her and say rude things.
Get him out of here.
Have I said something amiss?
Get him out.
George was depicted as the quiet one in whom there is more than meets the eye. And I think that's an astute bit of characterization.
It was on the set of A Hard Day's Night that George met Patty Boyd, a model-turned-actress who had a bit part in the film. A romance quickly blossomed.
I think he initially came on as a sort of rough, untamed Liverpudlian, but she perceived a sensitivity beneath that, and I think that was what was attractive.
In January 1966, Patty and George were married, with Paul and Brian Epstein sharing Best Man honors.
Well, actually, I asked Patty out when we were making the film, and she said no, which was very embarrassing at the time, but it all worked out right in the end.
While the Beatles were shooting their next movie, Help, a spoof on Beatlemania, an incident on the beach where they were filming provided Harrison with another important introduction, one that would forever change George and the group.
They're filming on the beach, one of those wacky Beatles scenes in the sea, and an Indian in a turban rides along the beach. He stops and he hands George Harrison a book. It's a book on Indian religion, and he just rides off. And George looks at the book and he's hooked.
In the summer of 1966, George Harrison was just 23 years old and already a seasoned performer.
She said she loves you, and you know that can't be bad.
The Beatles were about to launch their third cross-country tour of America, but Beatlemania was taking a darker turn.
Don't forget the Beatle boycott is still in effect. We have not forgotten what the Beatles said.
America was outraged. John Lennon had said that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus, and the band found themselves apologizing.
You know, I just said what I said and it was wrong or was taken wrong, and now it's all this.
The context it was meant was the fact that Christianity is declining, and everybody knows about that.
The fans forgave the Fab Four and flocked to their shows. But by now, Beatles concerts had become so frenzied that the band couldn't hear themselves playing over the crowds. George Harrison was a perfectionist who'd always taken his guitar playing seriously, and it especially frustrated him. At the end of the tour, the band announced that it would be their last.
And John looked at me and he said, "Oh, that's it, no more touring." And a voice on the other side of the dressing room said, "I'm no longer a Beatle." Guess who? Dear George. What he was saying seemed to be, to me, a weight lifted from his shoulders that he doesn't have to go on the road again.
George was perhaps the main advocate of the Beatles packing up. Beatles concerts have become more like tribal gatherings, and they were just sort of playing into this wall of screaming.
The Beatles retreated from the concert stage and behind the walls of their Abbey Road studio. There, they set out to redefine the role of rock stars. They produced ambitious records that critics called art, records that climbed straight to the top of the charts. In 1966, the album Rubber Soul revealed a new, more lyrically mature Beatles. And on the song Norwegian Wood, George Harrison introduced fans to an Indian instrument called the sitar.
I once had a girl, or should I say, she once had me.
At the time, he was looking to break out of his role as the baby of the band.
He was beginning to feel like, you know, an adult musician with stuff to say.
Harrison had written songs before, but it said Lennon and McCartney generally limited him to 2 per album.
He had to struggle to get his songs accepted, And at one point, he actually went to John with them before presenting them to the group in the hope that John would be able to kind of improve upon them, or at least give it some sort of executive clearance.
The Beatles were changing pop culture and revolutionizing pop music. Now, Harrison was emerging as a songwriter. In 1966, Revolver opened with his song Taxman, a response to the high taxes that the Beatles faced in the UK.
'Cause I'm the tax man. Yeah, I'm the tax man.
But meanwhile, their internal power struggles were just beginning to divide the band, especially Harrison and his schoolboy chum, Paul McCartney.
I think he regarded Paul as some sort of insurmountable barrier to sort of deeper intimacy with John, who was somebody that he much admired. Sometimes he'd be very upset, the others amused indifference to him.
George Harrison was confronted with more than indifference when an old Liverpool friend visited the Beatles in 1967. Tony Crane found Harrison sitting idle while Lennon and McCartney were composing.
He said, I'm getting fed up with this. He pulled me to one side. He said, every time they write a song, he said, Paul now wants to play lead guitar on it, and John wants to play lead. He said, and they're asking me to play one note. He said, it's absolutely crazy. He said, but I'll just do it. Keep them quiet. Anything for a peaceful life.
A peaceful life was something Harrison craved more than the others. In fact, he'd always rejected celebrity. Now, it seemed he was searching for something much bigger. And for a while, it looked like LSD was the answer.
Sometimes it can lead you on to sort of untold levels of creativity, or else it can be the beginning of a spiritual journey. And I think that that was what happened to George.
LSD turned Harrison and the others onto psychedelic culture. And the result was the dazzling 1967 album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The record reflected the times.